Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
How are you feeling after lunch?
Really great.
Good. Lots of energy in this room. I'm very grateful for it. I'm very grateful for the wonderful presentation given by our Nonviolence and Economic Justice work group. That work is definitely inspirational to all of us, and in particular this gun violence task group that has just recently formed. As Jerry concluded her opening remarks today, truly we've all been impacted by the events that took place in December in Newtown and also in Pasadena, where we suffered from our own incident of gun violence as someone was murdered in our community on Christmas Day. And because that makes our heart beat fast, and because we have to say enough is enough and we will not tolerate this anymore, All Saints has acknowledged the fact that we have a responsibility to take action on this issue. And so it was in collaboration with Ed and in early conversations and myself, given that I'm the community perspective on how these social justice issues play out in Pasadena, with Francisco, our Peace and Justice Director, and Laura Thornton from Children, Youth, and Families Department, that we discerned that we needed a task force, and we entrusted 3 of our fabulous parish leaders to engage in this work. So today it is my great pleasure to introduce you to them and for them to share with you a little bit about what we've been working on in just the past couple of months. So I'm going to pass it on to Dennis Hernandez, our fearless leader, and you will also hear from Virginia Classic and Kathy Kate. Thank you.
Emphasis on fearless. I'm going to start with a little video that we captured what we're doing here.
Someone needs to do their job. This is unnecessary. She wasn't a bad kid. She wasn't, and when I say bad kid, she wasn't a kid that didn't have any direction. She had direction, and she had hope, she had a future.
A child's heart is her mother's pulse. A child's heart is the core of a mother's purpose. Today I am here for every beat lost. I am here to tell every mother who has felt her core broken because of senseless gun violence. I'm here to tell you that there is an army of mothers behind you. An army of moms who will do everything we can to make sure that there will indeed be a vote. And that vote will be the beginning of the end of gun violence in America.
Why in the world would anyone not agree that you should get a background check before you buy a firearm? If you disagree with background checks, the logical jump is that you believe it's okay for criminals and the dangerously mentally ill to buy guns. This is, as one newspaper called it yesterday, a real no-brainer.
These parents should not be defined by their laws. That's not fair. Should be defined by the love they have for their children and the love we have as a country for all of our children, whether they're in Newtown, Connecticut, or Chicago, or Los Angeles, or New York, wherever they are.
A child or teen is shot every 30 minutes. The time to act is now.
I think it's a wonderful introduction to what the task force is all about. First of all, let me introduce the task force. My name is Dennis Hernandez. I am the chair of our task force. Virginia Classic and Kathy Kate are members, current members, although we hope to go expand that in the near future. Our desire today is just to give you a little bit about how we got started and a little bit of the foundations of why we're here and then what we hope our agenda to be. All right. So to begin with, our community. On December 30th, 2012, the Pasadena area leaders held a peace and unity rally against violence. And about 250 people gathered outside All Saints to hear clergy and city leaders and police officials denounce recent violence. The events at Sandy Hook on January 10th, after the violence at Sandy Hook, members of All Saints met in a listening and discussion session to discuss the strategies and issues related to gun violence, both nationally and in Pasadena. After that listening session, Reverend Bacon told the staff that he wanted to see sustained action from All Saints to address the issue of gun violence. And on January 29th, our task force met. At that meeting, we decided on a couple of purposes. Our mission is to implement and expand upon the recommendations of the January 10th listening and discussion session, and to develop timely and effective strategies for sustained action by the All Saints community on the issue of gun violence. This is a team effort. What we want to do is present, first of all, some of the foundations in our faith for addressing this issue, a bit about our church, a little bit about gun violence and public health, and then what our agenda is. I'll turn it over to Virginia to talk a bit about the faith foundations.
We are going to briefly visit 8 passages from Scripture that really reflect 4 major themes that I personally see as informing our work for gun violence prevention. We start at the beginning of our holy history with that passage that is foundational for so much of our peace and justice work. God created humankind in God's own image, imago Dei, image of God. And I'll read from this new, hold on a second, a book that was just published, Peace in Our Cities, Rabbis Against Gun Violence, published in January, and it's 18 essays by rabbis. And Rabbi Jill Jacobs says this: our primary responsibility as human beings is to ensure the dignity and safety of other human beings. Every time a person dies by gunfire, the divine image is diminished, and God suffers. Now I'll need my clipboard again. I was at the Islamic Center on Thursday, and I said to my friend Jihad Turk, so we have this passage about image of God in the Bible. Do you have anything like that in the Quran? He said, well, yes, we do. Chapter 38. Behold, I am about to create a human being out of clay, and when I have formed him fully and breathed into him my spirit, fall down before him in prostration. So here in the Abrahamic faiths, this is foundational for all of our work. We also have a God that loves us. This is one of my favorite passages from Hosea. This is the way God loves us. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and I called my son out of Egypt. I myself taught Ephraim to walk. I took him in my arms. I led them with reins of kindness, with leading strings of love. I was like someone who lifts an infant close against his cheek. Stooping down to him, I gave him his food. Ours is a God that picks us up and holds us next to God's cheek. Think of the children that are killed by gun violence. These are the children that God wants to hold next to God's cheek. So we move from this to looking at God who understands grief and anguish. A voice is heard in Ramah, deep anguish and bitter weeping. Rachel weeps for her children, refusing to be comforted, for her children are gone. And throughout the Hebrew scriptures, there is always that vision of redemption and hope. Be glad and rejoice forever and ever for what I am creating, because I now create Jerusalem joy and her people gladness. I shall rejoice over Jerusalem and exalt in my people. No more will the sound of weeping or the sound of cries be heard in her. No more will be found the infant living a few days only, or the old man not living to the end of his days. That's the vision that God has for all of us. And one more passage of that vision. This is a favorite of mine too, from the prophet Zechariah. Old men and old women will again sit down in the squares of Jerusalem, every one of them staff in hand because of their great age. And the squares of the city, downtown Chicago, South Central Pasadena, will be full of boys and girls playing, and shall we add safely, in the squares. This is God's vision. This is what God wants for the human family. We turn now to the Gospels. We know that Jesus' ministry was about healing. This is central to Jesus' ministry. And also there's the passage from John, I have come that you might have life, and that you might have that more abundantly. And then in the epistles, the model for the early Christian church was not one of rugged individualism, it was of community, where the church cared for every single person in that church community. And that is the model for how we look at community. The whole law is fulfilled in one word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You must all think of what is best for each other and for the community. So this is just very broad brush, looking at our early covenant, the Hebrew scriptures, the prophetic voice, Jesus' ministry, and the early Christian church as a way of looking at our foundation for the faith mandate for approaching gun violence. And now we'll take a look at what 3 theologians have said. I will just let you read that, but I really want you to focus on the numbers that Dr. Kinnaman, the General Secretary of the National Council of Churches, the numbers of gun violence victims compared to all the people who have been killed in wars. We have a Memorial Day that remembers the men and women in our country who have been killed in wars. We may need to have a Memorial Day for those killed by gun violence. The numbers are staggering. And another friend of our parish, David Gushy, who has been with us on 2 occasions. This is something he wrote after Newtown. And then another friend of All Saints. And now Kathy will talk about the Episcopal Church. Thank you.
So the Episcopal Church, I'm going to look at it from 3 different levels: our own community, the diocese, and the national church. We have a yearly convention in the Episcopal Church for our diocese, which is usually out in Riverside or San Bernardino, and it's a place where we can present resolutions for action, if that's something that the church decides that they want to do as a way of pursuing it. The diocese also has something called Hands in Healing, and I was not able to find out as much about this as I wanted to, but it started in 2002 as a way of bringing various communities together that are dealing with violence on a regular basis. They did some pilgrimages, they did some kinds of teaching kinds of things. So there's some work that's going on at the diocese level that has to do with violence in general, not necessarily just with guns. I was a little dismayed to see that there had been no resolutions in the last, I think, 3 years at our local diocesan level that had anything to do with gun violence. 2 things that have happened from the presiding bishop are sort of overwhelming, and we're going to give you copies of it. But The presiding bishop submitted testimony to Congress regarding the call to action against gun violence. It's extremely well worded and done, and was a very strong message, I think, to the congressional folks. We have copies of that we're going to give you, and I would really, really encourage you to read it. It does call all of us to pursue the safety of guns, how we as a nation are dealing with the ongoing gun violence. The House of Deputies just on the 27th, 2 days ago, passed a resolution regarding gun violence and took a big chunk of the presiding bishop's statement and put it into that. I don't know the ways of the world well enough, and I suspect Susan can tell us, if that then means that it will go to the next general convention, which is every 3 years.
It doesn't need to.
It doesn't need to.
During the Triennial Executive Council, which is both bishops and deputies, it speaks for the church, so it holds the weight of a speaking for the church resolution. It was very comprehensive.
Terrific. And the national church, the General Convention, has had a few things regarding guns over the last several years, but again, this statement that just came out was very strong, and we also have that for you today. There are other networks within the Episcopal Church that I think are evolving, and one of the things we keep saying to ourselves is we've been struggling with this for all of a month now, is that we don't want to reinvent the wheel, and we want to be as collaborative as we can, but we also still want to make sure that we're in a leading position in terms of taking a position on gun violence. And we have our Peace and Justice Ministries. As you heard earlier today from the Nonviolence Group, there's a huge overlap here. And our Peace and Justice Ministries have always called us to the courageous and risk-filled work of embodying our baptismal promise to strive for justice and peace and respect the dignity of every human being. Thank you.
We're going to talk briefly about why it's so important to talk about gun violence prevention as a public health issue. Anything that contributes to human disease, injury, or death is a proper concern for public health. And the magnitude of the impact of gun violence in this country makes gun violence a public health epidemic. Gun violence is too often thought of as a crime problem. Guns are used in crimes with devastating circumstances. But a crime approach to gun violence puts resources into apprehension, adjudicating, incarcerating, with tougher sentences the primary approach to prevention. The crime definition has a number of serious shortcomings. First of all, it does not cover nearly all gun tragedies. Approximately 54% of gun deaths are gun suicides. Others are unintentional shootings. So while there are an average of 32 gun homicides a day, there are 82 gun deaths every day. The homicides, the suicides, unintentional shootings. So here are advantages of a public health definition, which we are working with as a task force. It focuses on prevention, it looks at all gun deaths and injuries, involves a wide range of disciplines, and uses a scientific method, defining the problem, using data collection, identifying risk factors, developing interventions, testing those to see which ones are effective. Implementing effective interventions, thank you. In addition, a public health approach takes a serious look at how our healthcare dollars are spent. The direct medical costs for gunshot wounds total $6 million a day. And when all other factors are considered, the cost of the criminal justice system, emergency response, loss of productivity, the annual cost of gun violence is estimated to be more than $100 billion a year. Think of what those dollars could do for the well-being of people in our communities. And of course, there can be no price tag on human suffering. The one measure that cannot be adequately studied is the grief and pain that we as a society suffer. Every time a firearm is used to kill or injure, each killing or injury affects more than just one victim. It affects the victim's family, friends, community. Whether direct cost, indirect cost, emotional cost, or the cost of freedom is used as a benchmark of the cost of firearms to society, the total price is mounting. I want you to notice the date on this. I went down to my garage, to my filing cabinet, and pulled out my gun violence from a public health perspective file from 1993. This is almost 20 years ago. And we have made no progress. What might be not well known is that in 1996, Congress passed legislation effectively barring the Centers for Disease Control from doing any research related to gun violence. This extended to the whole Health and Human Services. This was the result of a piece of research that indicated that a gun in the home was actually more likely to be used against someone in that home rather than in self-defense. And so gun lobbies got very upset that maybe CDC was showing that gun violence might be something that there needed to be concerned about. And so they were able to pass this legislation. 17 years without any federally funded research into gun violence. And we can celebrate. One of the things President Obama has done in his plan, now is the time. He has issued a presidential memorandum directing the Centers for Disease Control and scientific agencies to conduct research into the causes and prevention of gun violence. So we're moving ahead with this. Okay.
Some useful statistics. Thank you very much. That was an incredible presentation.
More than 30,000 people are killed by firearms each year in this country.
According to the Centers for Disease Control, each day across this nation, 47 children and teenagers are shot.
The Children's Defense Fund estimates that 2,391 children have been shot by guns since the 113th Congress convened on January 3rd, 2013.
Abused women are 5 times more likely to be killed if an abuser owns a firearm.
A gun in the home is associated with an increased risk of suicide, 2 to 10 times that of homes without guns.
Every time a gun injures or kills in self-defense, one is used 11 times for a completed or attempted suicide, 7 times in a criminal assault or homicide, 4 times in an unintentional shooting, death, or injury.
According to the Los Angeles County Coroner, 75% of all homicides in Los Angeles County in 2009 were caused by use of a firearm, a trend that is mirrored nationally.
Homicide is the second leading cause of death among 15 to 24-year-olds and the primary cause of death among African Americans of that age group.
They're all shocking, but that last one is perhaps the most shocking for me. One of the things I wanted to say about in terms of the church, at the listening session we talked, one of the things that was talked about was the money, follow the money. And the national church, as you heard earlier today, does scream on its investments in terms of military, which is certainly a step towards guns. The local diocese, the Los Angeles diocese does not provide a screen. So it's one of the things that we're very eager to look into and continue to pursue in terms of where we allow our money to be long-term. One of the other things that's taking place in the community is mayors have figured out that they're one of the biggest gun buyers in the country for their police. So they are now also beginning to look at what kinds of practices the different gun companies pursue that they buy their guns and ammunition from.
And that reminds me of my own sense of conspiratorial theories. Maybe the whole sequester of the entire budget is a conspiracy by the NRA to prevent the CDC from doing research on gun violence. So something to think about. And that was a joke, by the way, but they took it that way. All of that that leads to what this task force is all about. Our strategy really is two things: educate and advocate. At this stage, and again, it's a very preliminary stage, we basically had about 4 weeks to meet, to consider, and to think about what we want to do. But at this point, some of the things we want to accomplish are education through teaching, education through our action table, and then try and create a robust social media and internet strategy. On the advocacy side, I think our plan is to collaborate with state, local, and national organizations who are engaged on the issue of gun violence, and then to mobilize our community as issues arise and as necessary. Some of the things we want to focus on are the Second Amendment, and what it means and what it doesn't mean. Well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That has been used and abused over the years by the gun rights advocates. What we want, the first thing we're going to do is bring some of the experts to all these things to help us understand what it means and does not mean. The national agenda currently is something that we want to pay attention to. That's part of the president's plan, and I think a lot of the national organizations are now unified in their definition of what the strategy is. That is universal background checks, limitations on military-style assault weapons and large-capacity magazines, stricter controls on trafficking and straw purchases, and prohibiting dangerous people from having guns. So far, like I said, it's been a short time that we have been together, but we accomplished some things. In January, 1,100 letters went out from the church in support of the president's leadership on gun violence. On January 10th, we had our listening and discussion session. On January 28th, our members of our committee met with Congresswoman Judy Chu, who's also a member of the Congressional Task Force on Gun Violence, and delivered letters to her. On February 4th, there was a interfaith call-in day that we organized and got people to participate in, to call into Congress on the issue of gun violence. And then on February 11th, Juliana participated in the Fuller Seminary NAMI conference on mental illness and gun violence, which was very, very productive. A lot of good information came out of that. What we are contemplating for the future and planning, not just contemplating, but planning at this point, are teaching on the issue of gun violence, and we're bringing folk together to talk about when, where, and what will be discussed at that teach-in. Social media, again, we want to focus on a Facebook page or internet resources that we can put up where people can go to immediately to find out what's going on. And if there's an issue like public health resources that somebody we know where to point to, where you can go immediately for access to public health, mental health connections. On May 11th, we have a gun buyback program in the city of Pasadena that we're coordinating with other churches in the area and with the Pasadena Police Department to host a gun buyback program. And then on May 12th, around that time, at the Rector's Forum, Adam Winkler is a professor at UCLA, an expert on the Second Amendment. He's written a book called Gunfight. Wonderful book, mostly on the topic of the evolution of the Heller case, which is the most recent decision of the U.S. Supreme Court on the Second Amendment, but the way he weaves it in the whole history of the gun control debate it's a wonderful read, and I'm sure you'll all enjoy that. So here we are. What we're all about is a task force guided by our Ministry of Faith and Nonviolence. The task force is focused on sustained action to address gun violence in our community and in our country through education and advocacy, to collaborate with other organizations on state, national, local levels, and to mobilize our parishioners in support of our mission. Finally, this is a resource page. I think we're going to be passing out copies of this just for your immediate information. The one thing I will say is there is a ton of information, websites, resources, statistics, one of our goals, our task is going to try and boil that down to some important, useful information. This is the beginning of that process. One last thought is that right now we are a task force of 3. We hope to grow that to include other participants, people who have an interest, people who have specific expertise on issues that we think are important, part of our community and beyond. So we invite you to join us. Thank you very much.
Kathy and Virginia, do you want to come back up?
Sure, yes.
So do you have questions?
Sure. Before we go to questions, I also wanted to add that we're happy also to announce that Ed has been invited to speak in Newtown. When is this? May 9th. May 9th to speak in Newtown as part of a network of clergy and advocates around the issue of gun violence. So we'll be able to share the message of All Saints and our solidarity with this national effort, which is great. And I think that's it.
Okay.
Thank you.
So do you have questions for this panel? Yes. Let's use the mic.
I just have a question of whether or not the task force is considering the other piece of the gun violence, media and education and advocacy for perhaps media awareness and the violence and entertainment, video games, things like that, and also the other mental health component. Are you working with other organizations that might be able to advocate for the gun violence?
The answer is yes and maybe. On the mental health issue, as part of our public health approach, I think that's going to be an important part of what we're all about, and how we define that going forward is going to be one of the tasks of the task force. On the issue of violence in the media, we really hadn't considered that at that point, but it is an important issue to consider. We're open, like I said, these are our initial thoughts. There's certainly room for further discussion on issues like that.
And we're certainly looking at this in a global perspective, and the entertainment industry would certainly be part of that global.
And I think as we grow, and we have talked about wanting additional people as part of this work, we will discern where people have energy and interests and passions, and there's so many layers of this. It's a combination of public policy and personal practice, as well as these other issues like the media. And so we do need to find, okay, who really is on fire about that and willing to take leadership. So yeah, multi-pronged, multi-layered.
With the caveat that I think what we have to do is focus our resources where we can be most effective. My personal perspective is there is a window of opportunity right now, just given the events that are happening, both nationally in Sacramento and locally. There's a real opportunity to affect change, and I think the initial thrust, our mission right now is to how best engage what we can do to move that agenda.
Any other questions?
The agenda of the National Advocacy Group, I noticed that there was no requirement that purchasers of guns have liability insurance. I think that should also be mandatory requirement for purchasing a gun?
I guess I would include that in the issue of things that are going on right now. There's some excellent proposals in Sacramento and I think four other states who have proposed an insurance requirement for gun owners. I think at one time even the NRA had supported that as a voluntary act, but I definitely agree that's something that as issues arise, as legislation moves forward, I think we should definitely get behind that.
Just to piggyback on, I think what his point is that gun manufacturers are protected from product liability. So, like Cadillac, if they make a bad car, I can sue them, but I can't sue Smith & Wesson.
Representative Schiff has introduced legislation within the last 6 weeks that would overturn that ban on the product liability. So that's another piece of legislation that we should certainly. Teddy bears are far more regulated than in our society.
Quick comment. One is that I know Francisco and Amanda are already working on the page on the website that will have resources for gun violence like we have for other task forces, so that should be up and running really soon. That's already in the works. And I had a question for Kathy about sort of using your best political acumen on resources. I mean, we keep hearing that this is the time for action and we can make a difference, and I believe that. We also keep hearing that the assault weapon ban will not happen. So does that, how do we strategize that work? Or maybe I'm drilling down too deep for this, but to keep setting that goalpost out there, recognizing we may not meet that goal on this push, but that we're also going to end up with background checks or some significant. What do you think is our most likely outcome? What can we actually hope for?
I think we're likely to get background checks. I'll be very surprised if we don't. I thought that assault weapons was probably not going to happen. I'm more inclined to think that it might. I think it's more 50-50 than a 70-30 that I think it was before. And the point is the noise. We're in a peculiar situation here because both of our U.S. senators are huge advocates of banning assault weapons, so we don't really have anybody to lobby here. But your friends and family that live across the country need to keep the noise up. And we have many, both members of Congress as well as members of the State Senate and Assembly that are not necessarily supporters of these kinds of things. California has some of the strictest gun laws in the country. And there's a whole package of things that are being introduced to make some things even tighter. I'm more hopeful about assault weapons than I was. The magazine issue is pretty dicey. Part of what's going to happen here is everything going to be in one bill, so we're making people vote against something, or are we going to do it piecemeal so that we actually get some things done? We're just going to have to wait and see. But anybody that saw any of the testimony last week at the Senate Judiciary was pretty gut-wrenching. And my best friend from Tennessee, Mr. Lindsay, was pushing back on a chief of police, which I just thought was extraordinary. The police, by and large, are opposed to assault weapons. They don't want to go into a situation where somebody has an assault weapon. And Lindsay was basically telling him he was wrong. Okay. So
at press conference, if I could have one quick follow-up, what do you think our window is? If we're going to be strategic about advocacy in the legislative process, what is your best guess about what our real window of opportunity to be influential is? What are we designing?
Initially I was gonna say 6 weeks. I think that's wrong. I think what's important, as Virginia pointed out, something that's 20 years old, we have to keep this going. And as long as we keep the noise up, then and not say, oh, we're now moving on to something else, which is what people are concerned about with the president, that he's going on to immigration, he's going on to other things. We have to keep the noise up. We have to be educated in terms of what the Second Amendment means, and we need to keep talking to people as well as our elected officials. It's at least this Congress, and I think it goes well into the future.
We have a question from Mary Ann.
Let me just follow up on that. There was a markup this week in the Senate on a series of bills, and what they did was they broke these 4 issues into different bills, and they have. I haven't heard yet what the result was, and yes, I think I even heard Senator Feinstein was saying that she was hopeful but not real, positive on this issue of assault weapons. The nice thing is that we're at the beginning of the legislative session. We're at the beginning of a congressional term that goes 2 years, so there's still opportunity. Everything else is going on.
I thought 100 Republicans would come out for marriage equality, so.
Exactly, yeah. Or violence against women, So I think you're exactly right.
That's why the noise is so important.
Yep. Oh, good.
I just want to comment about being in this for as long as it takes. What has been said from the gun lobby is the strategy is to wait until the Connecticut effect wears off. And we cannot let the Connecticut effect wear off. That's what that's our goal.
And I think the special election in Chicago is going to be a bellwether.
Yep.
Definitely going to be a bellwether that the NRA doesn't have the same sort of influence that it had just a year ago.
Marianne.
Just 2 things. There's been discussion about support groups of families and friends being affected by gun violence at the church.
Amongst ourselves, we have talked about how do we identify those resources and make sure people are aware of them. How we do that, through the resources we can create, the website or Facebook page or anything like that. Beyond that, I think we've discussed it.
And also, any talk about how we might involve the children of the parish by having them turn in their violent video games. I know there's kind of different thoughts on research about violent video games, but that latest guy in Santa, where was that, in the Newport area, that they said his actions were exactly those of the video games that he had been playing. So has there been
It's a wonderful idea.
Kids?
The kids will definitely be part of our teaching. What that looks like, we're a month old.
Did you see the flash mob they did when it was in Chicago? Where they showed up and then the people lay down on the ground and they threw chalk things, and it was supposed to be Newtown connection. It was.
Can I also respond to that question, which I think is very important? I think part of the reason why, even sort of on the staff end, our role sort of in this committee is to help facilitate and to draw resources for the work of this group. And that's part of the reason why Laura is on this committee, because of that critical piece of the parish education and advocacy, which goes across from children, youth, and families. And so she's already engaged in those conversations with the different areas of work, be it parent culture, the connection with the nonviolent parenting that Jonathan spoke about in the God, My Parents and Me group. So it's part of the plan. We don't have the detail yet. So.
There's a question back here.
Thank you. I guess it may be more of a comment, but I understand that we haven't been able to do the extensive research that we wanted to do in order to be able to understand sort of what's underpinning a lot of the gun violence. And I do appreciate the efforts that the President has made in order to try to move us forward. But I'm concerned that there's a lot of focus on sort of the mental health component. As someone that works very closely with a lot of mental health individuals impacted by mental health, and already seeing sort of the degree of stigma that's attached to that and a lot of the other issues that they are confronted with, I'm concerned that the dialogue is so much heavily focused on making sure that folks that are mentally ill aren't getting guns. And I'm wondering if that's just a convenient way of actually trying to say that we're doing something. So I'm trying to get a sense of what is the volume of mental health cases involving gun violence, because it seems to me that may be blown out of proportion.
Well, first of all, that's why we are so carefully saying public health, not just mental health. That it's a broad spectrum. That the amount of mental health issues here is actually fairly limited. that it's accidental, it's suicide, it's the other kinds of things. And Juliana's going to speak more to it. But we very deliberately went with public health rather than mental health.
And I appreciate you bringing that up, Will, because the biggest therefore that came out of that mental illness and gun violence conference that we had at Fuller in conjunction with NAMI and All Saints and some other nonprofits in Pasadena was that those people who suffer from mental illness are more likely to die due to gun violence as opposed to be perpetuators of crimes due to gun violence. And so it's an important part of the work. We can't deny that some people do suffer from mental health illness and that leads them to commit violent acts. Yes, but that is not the majority of the population who is perpetuating these crimes. If more so than anything, they're actually falling victim to gun violence. So again, just to reiterate what Kathy said, that's why we want to look at it more from a public health perspective as opposed through a mental health paradigm.
I think on the mental health issues, there's also an issue, there's a focus on people who are receiving treatment, and I think I read something that said that the people who are getting treatment are less likely to commit crimes. It's the people who are undiagnosed or in denial or whatever, don't believe in psychiatry or psychology, who are slipping through the cracks. I guess the other thing I'd say on the other side is I was listening to something on NPR, the interview. It was Terry Grossman, someone who'd done a lot of study into gun violence, and he was saying that things like gun buyback programs are really just window dressing. They take maybe 300 guns off the street, and most of the time people are turning in guns that are broken or old or whatever, and you'd have to take. I think he said you'd have to take something like 10,000 guns off the street in order to save one life, and most a really good gun buyback program gets 500, 600 guns. So it's.
Let me just respond. We had a really good discussion around that issue in our task force around our own gun buyback program, and yes, there are people out there who believe that the symbolic significance of getting guns off the street, I think, can't be underestimated. You can look at the cost-benefit analysis of how much does it cost per gun, but particularly in a community that's been affected, or in Black and Latino neighborhoods, I mean, there's no better way to convince people that there's that guns may not be the answer if you can get people to see other people turning in their guns.
And if I could speak to that a little bit more, because I've been part of the conversations that are happening here in Pasadena about what this gun buyback is going to look like. And certainly, to speak to what Dennis mentioned, it's a symbolic gesture, yes. And do symbolic gestures have significance? Absolutely. Does it send a message to our community that we don't want guns in our homes? Absolutely. Does it say that we want a more nonviolent and peaceful community? Absolutely. So that's one reason for engaging the work, and I think there's great value in that. And many of us who are part of the planning process have really worked hard to bring our city officials and our Pasadena police officials to buy into that as well. The other issue is a improperly stored gun in a home is a dangerous weapon and is part of gun violence in the way that we don't typically think of gun violence. And so that kind of goes back to something that was mentioned earlier in our presentation. We want to address all forms of gun violence. So it's not just what we typically think of, the gang activity and the murder that happened down the street, but a violent act happens when somebody commits suicide in their home. And the community is impacted negatively as a result of that. So if we can get an unused, unwanted, improperly stored gun out of a home, then I think we're making a positive difference in our community, and we're also preventing accidents from happening. So this idea of taking guns off the street through gun buyback programs, I would agree, that's probably not what we're doing. We're probably not getting gang members or street criminals turning in their guns. but are we positively making a difference in our community by preventing people from having accidents or committing suicides, or preventing a criminal from robbing a home and accessing a gun and then producing a gun that now is entering into a criminal market? Absolutely.
We have one last question.
Two additional thoughts before we leave that subject. One is I'd like to see, and we're just talking about this now, a gun safety element to a buyback program. And one of the things I put on the table is, can we get use part of the resources to provide gun locks or to provide gun safes to people who do own guns. It's a harder task, but the issue of safety can't be underestimated. The other point I wanted to make was a conversation I had just before our presentation on the issue of the economic justice issue, and I think that's going to be an important part of what we're all about. The gun violence hits our communities hard. It is devastating in Black and Latino neighborhoods, and I think Juliana and I have talked about this a lot. That we want to find a way to use whatever resources we have to address that specific issue. Find ways that we can call out, to call the attention of the American public, the particular problems that hit Black and Latino neighborhoods.
Okay, our last question.
Just to Will's point, mental health to me in itself is a noble cause, and I think we need to address it. But I do think that the way it's being put into this gun debate is a bit distracting, because if you take away guns, the Aurora shooter and the Newtown shooter are just people with mental health issues. And so they're just people with mental health issues, as opposed to mass shooters with mental health issues. So the problem, yes, is mental health, but the main problem is guns. And when people start to interject that mental health issue to me, it becomes this distraction to take away from the fact that we shouldn't have to have guns.
Thank you.